Heavy bombers from the United States, equipped with Boeing B-29 superfortresses, unleashed destruction on key Japanese cities. On September 2, 1945, as the Japanese delegation stood aboard the battleship USS Missouri, preparing to sign the documents that would officially end World War II, a large formation of B-29s flew low over Tokyo Bay. It served as a powerful reminder of the devastation their nation had endured. Japan's cities had been reduced to rubble, and crematories across the country still smoldered with the aftermath of firestorms. Nearly 70% of those interviewed by U.S. military officers after Japan's surrender stated they couldn't endure another day of war. National morale was shattered. Most Americans, especially young Army and Marine troops preparing to invade the Japanese home islands of Kyushu and Honshu, believed that the atomic bomb had forced Japan's surrender. However, the reality was that the nation had already been brought to its knees before the first atomic test even occurred at the Trinity site in New Mexico. 2 months earlier, B-29s had already delivered devastating firepower across Japan. These bombers became symbols of American air supremacy. By September 1945, the B-29, a massive 4-engine aircraft, had become a dominant force. It had originally been designed to target Nazi Germany, with initial proposals dating back to fall 1940, when the U.S. War Department was preparing for possible involvement in Europe. The bomber's entry into service was delayed due to design issues and production setbacks, and by the time it was ready in mid-1943, its role in Europe had diminished. Production began, and theater commanders quickly demanded access to the new aircraft. Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, the air commander in the Southwest Pacific under General Douglas MacArthur, had been deeply involved in the B-29's development while at Wright Field in Ohio in 1941. Despite his earlier contributions, he was shortchanged in aircraft and personnel due to the European theater's priority. Kenney wanted to deploy B-29s from Australia and later the Philippines, but General Henry Hap Arnold had his own ideas. Arnold, though holding high rank, had never fought in combat or commanded troops directly. This presented him with a chance to lead a new campaign. He created a new Air Force unit under his direct command, headquartered in Washington, D.C. The newly established 20th Air Force would be controlled by Arnold's staff, who would select bombing targets and direct missions from afar. Rather than assign B-29s to existing overseas commands, Arnold ensured this strategic bombing unit remained separate. Political motives also influenced B-29 deployment. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, seeking a third term in 1944, strongly supported initiating an aerial bombardment campaign against Japan. With his re-election approaching and conservative opposition mounting, launching B-29 raids became politically advantageous. Despite their long range, only 4 locations in the world were suitable for launching B-29 attacks on Japan. The Soviet Union was off-limits due to its neutrality, and the Aleutian Islands, though within reach, presented severe weather challenges. Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, supported establishing B-29 bases in the Mariana Islands. Doing so would increase the importance of the Pacific Theater, which was under Navy jurisdiction. He also backed Arnold's push for an autonomous command to prevent General MacArthur from gaining control over the B-29s. Arnold eventually settled on the third option, establishing advanced B-29 bases in China, allowing earlier attacks on Japan before bases in the Marianas were operational. It also aimed to boost Chinese morale, as they had been fighting Japan since 1931. Arnold appointed Brigadier General Kenneth B. Wolfe, who had overseen the B-29 project and was familiar with the aircraft, to command the first operational units. Wolfe formed the 58th Bombardment Wing in Marietta, Georgia, where B-29s were being built. He trained aircrews in Salina, Kansas, and initiated what became known as Operation Matterhorn. The plan called for stationing B-29s near Calcutta, India, with forward operating bases in the Chengdu region of China. However, because all operations in China depended on air transport, the logistics were extremely challenging. Although an airlift route between India and China already existed, Wolf requested that his XX Bomber Command be self-sufficient. This included a separate transport group using modified B-24 Liberators, converted into C-87 transports, and C-109 tankers. Some B-29s were also converted into tankers for fuel transport. The War Department used these conversions to maintain secrecy, as the aircraft were publicly presented as failed bombers turned into transports for the China-Burma-India theater. The first B-29 to head to India even made a publicity stop in England to give the impression it would be used against Germany. The first B-29s arrived in India in March 1944 and began transport missions by April. The Matterhorn plan scheduled the first combat missions for June. However, the operation's reliance on airlifted supplies proved overly optimistic. With the Japanese launching an offensive in China in May, supply demands soared. Theater commanders had to redirect resources meant for Matterhorn before it had launched its first strike. The first B-29 combat mission targeted the Makassan train yards in Bangkok, Thailand, and was scheduled for mid-May. Wolf wanted to conduct the attack at night since his crews were inexperienced in formation flying, but Arnold and his staff, shaped by European daylight bombing doctrine, insisted on a daytime precision strike. Wolf postponed the mission and intensified crew training. By June 5, 1944, Wolf had 112 superfortresses ready. Only 98 managed to take off, and one crashed shortly afterward due to severe weather. B-24s scheduled for the mission were canceled. The B-29s faced poor visibility, and 14 ran out of fuel. Some crews couldn't find the target, and each remaining bomber had to make independent decisions on bombing altitude and approach. One navigator described the confusion as resembling Saturday night in Harlem. Despite light enemy resistance, monsoon storms made the return flight dangerous. Fuel shortages forced over 40 B-29s to land at various airfields across the region, and 3 failed to return to China. 5 B-29s and 17 crew members were lost or unaccounted for. One bomber crashed while landing. Photos after the mission showed the target suffered only minor damage. Still, the 20th Air Force deemed the operation a success. The next day, Arnold ordered Wolf to prepare an attack on Japan itself, set for June 20th. Wolf now faced the difficult challenge of restocking his Chinese bases. When they ran out of supplies, an additional 3 days were needed because a mission involving 100 planes had been scheduled for June 23rd. The supplies initially meant for Matterhorn operations in China were instead transferred to the 14th Air Force by General Joseph Stilwell, the senior American official stationed in China. General Wolf informed Arnold by cable that he could prepare 50 planes by June 15th, or 55 over the next 5 days. In response, Arnold ordered an increase in hump airlift operations and directed an attack using 70 airplanes. The 20th Air Force decided to initiate a campaign targeting the Japanese steel industry, with the Imperial Steel Works at Yawata on the island of Kyushu selected as the first target. The attack coincided with the scheduled invasion of Saipan on June 15th, and Washington aimed to send a signal to Tokyo that the war was nearing its end. Wolf managed to send 92 B-29 bombers to China, but 9 of them arrived with mechanical issues. Every bomber was fully armed and ready for action. All that the crews required from the Chinese bases were fuel and rest. Although 75 airplanes were ordered to participate, only 68 managed to take off. 1 crashed, 4 were aborted, and 63 continued toward the target. The first flight reached Yawata just before midnight. Crews reported that conditions were acceptable, with less than 50% cloud cover, and that they had successfully bombed the target. However, despite decent visibility, the steel factory was completely dark, and smoke and haze concealed the ground. Only 15 pilots could drop their bombs visually. The other 32 used radar, which was considered less effective at the time. Although they faced heavy fighter and anti-aircraft fire, none of the B-29s were damaged over Japan. One bomber was lost while flying back over China. In total, 6 B-29s were lost due to various causes, and 55 airmen were reported missing. While the damage to the target was minimal, the attack made the Japanese realize for the first time that they were in imminent danger. The following day, news of the Japan raid competed with headlines from Normandy. The War Department announced the official establishment of the 20th Air Force. Despite the logistical challenges, Arnold urged Wolfe to increase pressure on Japan. The new objectives included attacks on Japanese steel mills in Manchuria, harassment raids on Japan, and a strike on the oil refinery in Palembang, Sumatra. Wolfe was soon called back to the United States for a major assignment. He was promoted to Major General and given command of the Materiel Command, making way for a more aggressive commander. Wolfe submitted a plan to attack the Anshan Steel Works in Manchuria with 50 planes, although Arnold had wanted 100. Brigadier General Laverne Blondie Saunders, commander of the 58th Bombardment Wing, took over operations of XX Bomber Command. On July 7th, 18 B-29s carried out a harassment mission over Japan. One aircraft failed, but the others managed to hit targets. 2 bombers had fuel issues but dropped bombs on a Japanese depot in Hangzhou, China. After assessing the situation, Saunders delayed the Palembang operation and prepared for an assault on Manchuria. July was a successful month for the Hump airlift, but a shortage of operational B-29s remained, partly because many had been converted into tankers. Saunders asked for a halt to transport operations 10 days before the raid and to begin moving bombers 5 days earlier. Major General Claire Chennault of the 14th Air Force opposed this, fearing that the bomber presence might provoke Japanese attacks. However, Washington approved the plan. Out of 111 bombers sent from India, 107 made it to China. The attack date was moved up to July 29th due to weather conditions. Rain grounded one group, but 72 aircraft launched, with 60 reaching the target. A crash and an aborted flight reduced the force. Initial bombs fell upwind from the target, and smoke obscured the mill. B-29 gunners claimed 3 probable and 4 damaged enemy fighters. The 444th Group bombed alternate targets in Takao and Changsha. One B-29 was lost after being attacked by 5 fighters, including a captured Chinese-American P-40. On August 10th, missions 5 and 6 of Matterhorn were launched simultaneously. They targeted the Palembang oil refineries and the docks at Nagasaki. A reduction in planes for the Palembang strike allowed both raids to proceed. Initially, Washington had wanted a daytime attack with 112 planes, but concerns about losses led to a change to dawn or dusk raids with fewer aircraft. Eventually, a night attack was approved. The plan included mining the Moesi River used to transport refinery exports. 8 mine-layer bombers from the 462nd Bomb Group dropped 16 mines under a 1,000-foot ceiling with great success. 1 crew ditched, resulting in 1 loss. Despite heavy preparations at Salane, only 24 bombers reached the target during the Palembang mission. The Nagasaki operation was smaller but significant, as B-29 gunner H.C. Edwards scored the first confirmed aerial kill of the war against a Japanese aircraft. Although photographic evidence was unclear, the mission was considered a success. No B-29s were damaged, despite claims of 37 Japanese fighters and heavy flak. Saunders faced opposition from Chennault, who argued that attacks on the steel industry were pointless. As senior aviation officer in China, Chennault issued an ultimatum: focus on the Japanese aircraft industry or move back to India. He considered the B-29s a liability in his theater, as they required precious transport space and extra defense. Disregarding Chennault, Saunders continued planning attacks on steel targets. On August 20th, 75 B-29s, took off for Kyushu. A runway collision delayed one group. Of those launched, 61 hit the target despite strong defenses. 4 bombers were lost, including 3 when a fighter crashed into one aircraft, bringing down 2 others in the wreckage. After reducing their loads for a night raid, 10 aircraft from the 462nd Group managed to fly over the target successfully. The day ended with the loss of 14 bombers and 95 crew members dead or missing. Though XX Bomber Command believed the target had been hit, Japanese records indicated otherwise. Major General Curtis LeMay arrived just in time to take over and prevent another planned raid on Manchuria. LeMay supervised a mission that inflicted serious damage on the Showa Steel Works. He implemented changes, increasing the basic bombing formation from 4 to 12 aircraft for a broader impact. He also reduced support personnel, consolidated squadrons, and introduced synchronous bombing, where only one bombardier used radar while others aimed visually. Despite LeMay's improvements, Matterhorn's time was nearly up. The final steel mission against Showa Steel Works caused minimal damage. Later raids targeted the Japanese aircraft industry and airfields on Formosa. River and harbor mining became the B-29's focus. In December, 20 Bomber Command launched a mission that Shino described as a defining moment. Since June, he had called for an incendiary bombing of the Japanese supply depot at Hankou using B-29s, but his requests were ignored. With Japanese forces threatening Allied bases in China, newly appointed Lieutenant General Albert C. Wedham pushed for the raid. Arnold approved the mission, recognizing the urgent military situation, even though there was uncertainty about Wedham's authority, since he commanded in China while the B-29s were based in India. The strike on Hankou was not the first incendiary attack carried out by a B-29 during November 1944. Arnold had already ordered experimental incendiary strikes from Saipan. On the evening of November 29, 1944, a mission was attempted against Tokyo, but it was unsuccessful. In contrast, the attack on Hankou was a major success, exceeding expectations. On December 18th, a mission involving over 200 aircraft, including 84 B-29s, caused severe damage to warehouses and docks, even though the original formation dropped its bombs upwind. Intelligence estimated that 40 to 50% of the target was destroyed, with only 38% of the bombs dropped. It was concluded that Hankou was no longer usable as a military base due to these events. Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell arrived on Saipan on October 20, 1944, to set up the headquarters of the 73rd Bombardment Wing, originally part of Operation Matterhorn, but later moved to the Marianas after Saipan was captured. His predecessor, Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, had arrived on Saipan earlier on October 12th, flying in the first B-29 to reach the islands. O'Donnell was the first person on the island, while Hansell, a firm believer in precision bombing and closely involved with the B-29 program, had previously served as Chief of Staff for the 20th Air Force. Both faced a serious shortage of bombers. The aircraft of the 73rd Wing were spread across the Pacific and back to Kansas, with daily arrivals reduced from 5 to just 2 or 3. The first mission, flown by the newly created 21st Bomber Command, targeted the Japanese supply station at Truk in the Caroline Islands. Truk was initially considered for the atomic bomb, but was later deemed worthless after heavy attacks by carrier-based Navy aircraft and B-24s from the 13th Air Force. The first mission involved a flight of 18 B-29s in October. However, 4 of these were canceled, including Hansell's command ship, which kept him from flying any combat mission. His successor, Brigadier General Loris Norstad, enforced a rule barring commanding generals of heavy bombing commands from flying over enemy territory. This was implemented shortly after Hansell's predecessor's death. When the United States intensified operations against Japan, Hansell and O'Donnell were replaced in planning by the 21st Air Force in Washington. The first objective was the destruction of Japan's aircraft industry. 21st Bomber Command focused on targets out of reach for B-29s based in China, but Tokyo was not among the initial priorities. The 20th Air Force chose the Nakajima aircraft plant in Musashino, second on the priority list, for the first major attack, largely to gain domestic propaganda value. Although it was said the plant produced over 30% of Japan's combat aircraft engines, the real reason was to create a media impact with headlines mentioning Tokyo. The attack was planned as a daylight precision bombing raid, but aircraft delivery issues delayed the operation until November, even though Hansel had submitted plans in October. A reconnaissance B-29 version, piloted by Captain Ralph Dittman, was the first to fly over Tokyo. Before the initial attack, 17 reconnaissance missions were conducted over Japan, 8 of which were weather-related. One F-13 was lost during a fighter attack over Nagoya. Hansel's operation, codenamed San Antonio the First, relied on intelligence suggesting Tokyo had 600 to 1,100 defending aircraft, but in reality, Japan had only 375 operational fighters across the entire country. The first attack was set for early November, 5 days before Navy carrier strikes, but these were delayed due to problems in the Philippine Sea. Hansel proceeded alone. Bad weather postponed the mission from November 17th until November 24th, when conditions finally cleared. O'Donnell led the mission with Major Robert K. Morgan, famous for piloting the Memphis Belle, as his co-pilot. A total of 111 B-29s took off from Saipan, but 17 couldn't drop their bombs, and another 6 were also unable to do so. Strong winds and poor weather over Tokyo made bombing difficult. Only 24 aircraft hit the target. Nevertheless, the results exceeded expectations. 48 explosives struck the plant, and Japanese records showed fewer than 150 casualties with minimal infrastructure damage. Still, the raid had a powerful psychological effect. Some Japanese civilian leaders recognized that the war was nearing its end. Production was eventually moved underground in January, even though none of the new underground factories became operational before the war ended.